To get things started, our first speaker was born into a second-generation nursery family and grew up in the green industry. Whether folding garden trays on Friday nights or detouring to move moose out of the nursery before school, her early summers were spent mowing between tree rows, transplanting stock, and working her way through the landscape division. After earning her Bachelor of Education and Bachelor of Science from the University of Calgary, she joined her family business, Parkland Nursery and Landscape Services, full-time. Now, as a project manager and landscape construction supervisor, she recently completed her landscape horticulturist, journey person, and Red Seal designation. As a third-generation grower, she serves as the chair of Landscape Alberta Nursery Producers, vice chair of CNLA's Grower Group, and vice chair of CNLA's Emerging Leaders Committee, while still finding time to work alongside her crews in the field. Please welcome and joining and having up to the stage, Breanna Beck.
All right, good morning. So my name is Breanna Beck, and I am from Red Deer, Alberta. Full disclosure, because I was working with Sarah from CNLA, and I was like, yeah, I have activities. And she's like, you have activities. So yeah, I do have an education degree. I get the opportunity to spend some time in the classroom in the wintertime and teaching anything from elementary to high school. And gained to be a part of the green industry. And when we were putting kind of our ideas together on what this Emerging Leadership Summit was going to look like, we were talking about the things that, what makes a good leader? Where do you see soft skills that maybe might be missing and we don't really talk about, we just expect people to have? And two of the things that kind of came up were communication and conflict management. Lots of times people don't teach us those skills or have those conversations. And so I'm going to be completely transparent. Today it's not going to be anything groundbreaking, but I hope that there's like maybe a nugget or two that you add to your toolbox, or even just get you to think in a different way. Here's my pet peeve as a substitute teacher, is I can jump into a classroom. And it's not so much the elementary kids. The elementary kids, you've created your best friend before morning recess on day one, and they're probably going to be in your wedding party 20 years later. But in high school, you can step in, and you can have a class of 35 kids. They've had 82 classes together, and you're like, hey, who's so-and-so in the corner? And they're like, I have no idea. And you're like, how have you been in this space? So we're going to do an icebreaker. And because I'm a competitive athlete, there are prizes. So on your table, there's a big white sheet that's flipped over, and it says Icebreaker Bingo. So we're going to have like all of 2 minutes to see if a table, can get a bingo. So I'll give you about 2 minutes to try and get that. We've had a couple bingos. So hopefully you got to meet and chat with a few people maybe you didn't know or learn something new. In your table, you also have another set of piece of paper. This is the last activity, and then I'll start talking. So you get to use your artistic skills. Those probably vary from table to table, person to person. So you and a partner, one person is going to grab a piece of paper, and it has a few different options for a plant. They're pretty simple drawings, nothing crazy. We're not looking for Picasso. And you're going to try and explain that drawing to your partner who's actually going to complete the drawing. So one is the drawer, one is the communicator. You can only use your verbal communication skills. You can't take over the pen and start doing it yourself, which I know sometimes in our day-to-day you just want to do the dang task because it'd be easier and faster and less painful to watch. But yeah, so one person's the drawer, one person is the communicator, and you have about 2 minutes to see how far and well you can do that, okay? All right, so if you haven't had an opportunity to see what you were supposed to be drawing, maybe take 10-15 seconds to see how close you came. What do you think? We'll have a little project debrief. What were like 3 things that made that successful or would have made that successful? So it's funny that you say active listening. So I was in a grade 3 classroom. My sister-in-law's a teacher. Her morning meetings include active listening. And you're supposed to ask the kids, you're like, what does active listening look like? And they recite it verbatim. And then, like, not 30 seconds later, they're not active listening. They say verbatim what you want to hear, and then they're all over the place. So active listening is like the number one thing. Is if you're not listening, it does not matter how good your person's communicating with you, things break down immediately. Clarity. If you don't have clarity, you're going to have room for misunderstandings. And then the area that I think probably as a society we could work on is that feedback. It's hard to give feedback. It's hard to give effective, meaningful feedback because sometimes you want to hurt people's feelings being like, whoa, you're way off track. Let's try this again. So feedback helps be successful in those kinds of moments. So my new favorite quote, and this is how I think I'm getting older, is that I have a favorite quote about communication. But the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. How many times in our businesses, regardless of where you are on that ladder, do you say to your team, well, I thought I told you that, or I thought we communicated something? And that sentiment usually happens and is said after something went wrong. And then you're like, oops. We all know that communication allows for stronger leadership. And when I say that, I've already made an assumption. And that can be dangerous, right? If I said, hey, we all know communication's important, and just left it at that, there may be people in this room that actually don't know this. And so making sure we take the time and space to being very clear and, stepping it back, especially on our day ones with our new staff or new teammates. I'm saying that, communication allows for our successful leadership, collaboration. It also, having good communication helps with trust. So I think the reason I care about communication, I was thinking about this morning when I was having breakfast, the reason I care about communication so much is I was a high-performance athlete. I played on Team Canada for ringettes, and I was a goaltender. And for those that have ever played sport, and specifically any sport that has a goalie, goalie's a very binary piece. You either play or you don't play. It's not like you had a couple shifts in a game, like those are your two options. And I had a ton of experiences where communication was terrible. Like, I just want to know where I stand. Whether that means I'm first string, second string, third string, tell me where I stand. Be honest with me so I can have my expectations and I can get mentally ready for those expectations. Am I going to play? Do I kind of have to wait till everyone gets injured before I play? Or will I be standing on that blue line ready to rock and roll as soon as the anthem's done? And then the other piece with communication, with that honesty, is being clear. I had a goalie coach for 3 years who, heart of gold, would do anything, give you the shirt off his back, but could not communicate. He talks in half sentences and sound effects. So I have no idea what Jeff is ever telling me. I'm like, does it look like this? And he's like, no. Would you like to try again on the explanation? Because I have nothing else to show you. I'm lost. So when we have types of communication, there's 4 of them, right? There's the verbal communication, nonverbal communication, written, and visual. How many people, when they get ready for their day with their team, uses one, gives them verbal instructions, tell them to head off? A few of us, okay? How many people use like a combo, like 2 or 3? Cool, like a few little hands going up. Yeah, so the more we can incorporate, the better chance that we're gonna be successful. So I get frustrated, I will be honest, because I use at least 3 types of communication every day. I am a no secrets kind of person. If you want to know what you're doing on Thursday, you can see it on the boards. We have our whole week in whiteboards. Looks like a classroom. And we have lists, written lists of what you're going to do. We have pictures and diagrams of where you're going to be on site, where you're dropping that load, maps, like you name it, we have it. And so when we have disconnection, I'm like, it's not for a lack of communication, because I did all these things. But it is because there's a lack of communication. Somewhere there's a communication breakdown, whether there's an assumption made, maybe there's too much information, too little information. Somewhere there was a communication breakdown. And lots of people will have an issue with under-communication, right? You didn't communicate enough. But there's also an issue with over-communicating. My dad, second generation, tons of strengths. One area that he is working on is his over-communication. That guy wants to tell you the plan, you the plan, you the plan, and not just like you're part of the plan, the whole plan, and then some. And then we lose people. Then we have too much communication, and we forget where we are and what our parts need to be, because we're so focused on another part here, someone else's role, and too much communication can have an issue. So we want to make sure that we send the message in an effective, concise way. Opposite end of it is that under communication. Is if we don't give enough communication, we have gaps and holes. Ambiguity, if it's not clear, how do we expect our team members to do what we need to do? So my example on this one is a couple of years ago, I was getting super frustrated with our team because of time off requests. And I was going to lose my mind. It was, how hard is it that like in the spring, summer, fall, you don't take a lot of time off? And we talk about it in orientation, and people are still like telling, like, you'd have kids coming up, or even adults, saying, hey, I need to be off for 2 weeks. And I'm like, oh, okay, like when? Oh, I leave in 3 days. And you're like, okay, what happened to the orientation bit? But then I went back to the orientation, and we say, like, we don't want to take time off in the season. And that was it. Is that enough information? No. So how are people supposed to meet my expectations or our team's expectations about time off if we don't clearly set them? So we now say no time off during May and June, a week off in the summer, how long you need to give us notice to take your week off, how much time you need to give us for that day off. And we've had way more success. But for a while there, I was frustrated at the team for not hitting my expectations, and they didn't have those expectations clearly defined. Assumptions, this is a classic. Definitely in a cross-generational company, and I'm sure lots of people are in here where you always hear older folks sometimes say, well, they should have known. I'm like, yeah, but we should have taught them. I had a teammate that I played with, and their rule with her then boyfriend, now husband, was they could never get into a fight with, you should have known. Because if you should have known, I should have told you. That ineffective feedback. So it's interesting, I send out a lot of things. I work with my entire family. So my mom, my dad, my older brother, and whether it's like tailgates, whether it's like quotes, I usually send it out to multiple people just to get some different eyes on it. And I'll send it to my parents, Deb and Dwayne, the same document. Dwayne is notorious for saying, looks good. Deb, same document, takes the red pen. Hey, is this super clear? Was this what you were gonna do? Like hers comes back and it looks like a battlefield compared to the looks good. So making sure that feedback is effective and really does help push things forward, and making sure that the point is very clear. And now we talked about communication, and the more I have grown in leadership, the more I realize how tight communication is and conflict. When there's usually, unless you're in elementary land, where conflict can arise from the craziest of spaces. But when we have communication breakdowns, that usually enables conflict to start. There's actually a study, and I apologize, it's a US study. I couldn't find a Canadian equivalency. It's a study done in 2024. Guess how many hours guess how many hours people deal with conflict, not just managers, but deal with conflicts in your work week? Any guesses? 20 hours. Well, this is going to be really pathetic. It's only 2.8. But that's each person. Okay, so 2.8 hours. Each person is spending time on conflict. Okay? Guess how many dollars that leads to unproductive time. In the US, unproductive time, because of 2.8 hours per person dealing with conflict, $359 billion of unproductive time. $359 billion because of unproductive time due to conflict management, or due to conflict. That's insane. Same study, what percent of managers what percent of the day do managers spend dealing with conflict? What do you think? 80. Man, when you guys pick big numbers, it's not really impressive. Yeah. Thank you. 2.5%. Yeah. No, 20 to 40%. Which I think about even in my day, and I'm like, yeah, I spend a lot, whether it's even like not necessarily bar brawls, like that's not the kind of conflict, but whether it's a subcontractor thinks that they need to execute the job at this time and they need to be on site first and they're really adamant about that. Like it's all those little things. Yeah, it builds up to a lot of time. But is conflict always bad? I would say no. And most people would argue that conflict, they want to avoid conflict, they're conflict avoidant, please don't put me in conflict. But conflict isn't always bad. This is the caveat, this is the asterisk. If it's approached in an effective capacity, if you have open communication, conflict can propel you forward, help with innovation, create teamwork. But it can also be incredibly destructive. So when we look at something, I felt this was a very Canadian piece that I can't really tell. Lots of people don't really know what ringette is, so I can never use a ringette experience, so I have to go back to hockey. But who's the best hockey player of all time? I'm sure there's probably 4 or 5 other popular opinions on this. And that conflict isn't always bad, right? It's a difference of opinion. But when we have a difference of opinion, how many times do we try and put our stance on it to try and change your opinion? And then conflict arises in that capacity. If you go into a space where there is conflict or where you have different opinions, and you go in a space that you want to just present and be heard, rather than try and change their opinion, it's usually a lot easier for yourself, and it's usually more productive as an entire team. When we have our communication breakdowns, usually you have misunderstandings. It's when the message is not clear that it creates friction. Lots of times people will say, well, I thought you meant this, and they didn't clarify it. When we don't have any adequate feedback, you're seeing some themes back and forth, right? It can lead to feedback it can lead to conflict because people either feel unvalued or confused about what their role is. When you make assumptions, misinterpretations, that can cause and lead to conflict. And then when we were talking here about lack of active listening, I think about in the classroom, how many people have seen that kid when you're telling a story or you're talking about something and they put their hand up and they've completely negated everything after their hand went up because they're so focused on their contribution. They're just waiting to tell you about your trip. You'll talk about Toronto. Toronto, Ontario has these resources, and they're like, all I want to do is talk about my trip, my family trip to Toronto, and tell the teacher about that. And they've nothing past that point have they actually gained because they're not active listening. They're listening to respond. I think this is also a really important quote because I think effective leaders do not avoid, repress, or deny conflict. I think lots of times leadership in companies, you want to avoid conflict, you want harmony. But if you keep doing that, you're missing out on some great opportunities. So how do we make sure that we don't have this unresolved conflict? How do we make sure that conflict is helping our companies move forward, our teams be productive, and that we're actually using it for innovation? I thought this is a really cool depiction of the conflict management styles. Has anyone seen this, heard this before? Maybe, sort of. So on the left-hand side, you have the goal. Like, what is the end goal of this interaction? On the bottom, it's your relationship and how important it is, okay? So the goal is it a not very important goal, might be very important, relationship not important to important. And you don't always have to fit in a box. It might be situational. There are some people that will always be a certain type of conflict management. So first you have avoidance. So that's that not very important goal, not very important relationship. I like to think of this person being kind of the jerk at the grocery store. I don't really know them. If you want to button me in line, does it really matter that I pay for my lettuce now or in like 3 minutes? So I'm probably not gonna jump at it. I'm not gonna be intense about it. I'm probably gonna let it slide. That is an issue, though, if it's in the workplace, if you're always avoiding conflict. Okay? You have the competing, which is the shark. We all know these people that no matter what you're talking about, they want to win. They don't care about the relationship necessarily. They want the outcome. They want to win. They want to be right. I have some people in here, they're like, yeah, I know who those people are in my life. Okay? You have the accommodator, which is like the teddy bear. And usually, they're the ones that make concessions, and they are the ones that are usually on the losing end of it. They want to just avoid the conflict as much as possible. They'll just do whatever they need to do to get it over with. So collaborating sounds really great, and it is, but it's usually surface level. Like you've collaborated, you've dealt with the conflict on like that surface level. The fox, being the compromising, usually is the one where you get in the nitty-gritty, you get in the weeds of the conflict, and you really are making concessions and be like, you know what, okay, here's a little give, here's a little take. So again, you don't have to be one of these people every conflict, every time, but it's important to know and think about where that scale is. I always think about the scale as to like, where do I need to be? Because there's some things I will fight hard for. And there's other things that I'm learning, because I used to be the person that every molehill or every hill was a hill to die on. I'm trying to become a better person at being like, does this really matter? My hill to die on was with my national sports organization, when they hired a coach that had concerns, and everybody knew about it. They had written concerns, and half the national team actually stopped playing because of this coach. That's a hill to die on. That was one where I wasn't going to be a turtle. I certainly wasn't going to be a teddy bear. And that's one where we had to advocate for ourselves, and we fought a little harder on that one. When we deal with conflict, the super important piece is to identify that there is conflict. How many times can you walk into a space and you don't really know what's going on, but you can feel that energy, that something's just not quite right? Okay? So understanding what the conflict is and understanding what the root causes are. Because sometimes you can see that there's conflict, but just like plants, the roots spread wide and far. Hopefully you pick up the conflict before it gets to that point. Having that open communication, making sure that everybody in the situation gets to be heard. And when you go from a place of openness and using like those I feel statements, can it really help diffuse a situation. It's hard to be defensive when you hear someone say, hey, I feel really hurt by this, right? Instead of going and attacking. And I think like I look back in my ringette situation with our head coach, and I actually got brought into a board meeting with our board of directors and our president, and we were talking about this big conflict. Like, you lost half of your national team is not playing. That's a pretty big deal. 22 people, 11 out. That's unbelievable. And so I remember getting ready for this meeting, and I was like, livid is not a strong enough word for how I felt. Like, I felt hurt, betrayed, angry, and when I was getting ready for this meeting, my emotions were probably about here, and there's tears. I'm the person that my anger is grounded in my tear ducts, and I had to really prepare for this so that I could articulate and communicate in a way that wasn't going to put the other table at a defense right off the get-go. And so I remember it was my turn to talk, and I said, like, I feel hurt. I feel like I was betrayed by my sport organization, because you made me have a choice to follow my passion or my safety, and that sucked. And all of a sudden, the board went really quiet. How do you get super defensive by that? Collaborative problem solving. Making sure that everybody's part of the solution, and I know that sounds super corny and super corporate, but when everyone has a skin in the game and has the opportunity to be a part of the solution, instead of it being a top-down, hey, thou shall now do whatever, it's those two kids on the playground, right? Instead of telling them what they're going to do, asking, what do you think is reasonable? What would you like to be seen? Because lots of times when conflict arises, people just want to be seen. And I know that sounds also like super soft, but people want to be seen and people want to be valued. So lots of times when there's conflict, like people feel like they're not valued or they weren't seen or they weren't heard. And so how do we rectify that? And then it's important that everyone agrees to the solution. Sometimes people have an idea of what the solution should be, but it's very different than what other people want it to be. So making sure that, hey, we collaborated, we came up, is everyone good with it? Yes. Okay. How we're going to move forward? What does that look like? How are we going to hold each other accountable? And this is the area that I think we're probably the weakest on, the follow-up. Because if your job is anything like mine, my to-do list is like a never-ending Rolodex. And I kind of have like 40 things that are on my to-do list. And every day, I'm like, what are my top 10? So there's some things that have been item 39 for like 2 months that probably should get dealt with, but they don't crack my top 10. And so they just get put on the back burner. And the follow-up is one of them. Because you're like, crisis averted, we dealt with the conflict, okay, moving on to the next, and especially in spring, the next fire. What do I have to put out now? But making sure that people are seen and valued and heard, and checking back in with them and say, hey, how are you feeling? You good with this? Have you seen progress? Are you comfortable? That goes a long way. So, I kept it to my 45 minutes. Nothing earth-shattering in the sense of communication or conflict management, but more just, I think the biggest thing is realizing how closely those two things are related, and that when we do have conflict, usually there was a communication breakdown. So when we deal with the conflict, you have to also take a step back, look at the root of the problem, and make sure that you also rectify where that breakdown happened to try and prevent it happening the next time. All those little things help build trust within your team and help push you and your team forward. And honestly, less conflict means that you just gain 20 to 40% of your day back.
Thank you, Breanna, for all your insights on communication and conflict. I know myself personally, I often find myself either over-communicating, under-communicating, and then I end up in a trap. So I definitely learned a lot there.